Today we'll be looking at an episode that has to do with time travel. You may be thinking, but we kind of already had an episode to do with that, just the previous episode, in which case you would be correct. The previous episode had to do with time dilation, whereas this episode has to do with actually traveling through time, except that it never actually happened, and I'm my own grandfather now. This is an episode where the crew comes across a planet that has exploded and sent ripples through subspace, which allowed people to go back through time to the point where it happened, where their own rescue attempt caused the event, but in a total demonstration of how paradoxes don't actually work, they then stopped the rescue attempt from happening, which then stopped the explosion from ever happening, and then Neelix says a few stupid lines, and then we're at the end of the episode. Now, let's get my notes out here. There's a couple of points I'd like to make as I go throughout this series that are well brought up within this particular episode, but have to do with something about the show as a whole. Now, I know I've already talked about this concept, so forgive me for repetition, but I'm going to try and go over this in brief. There's a concept called darkier and edgier. And in case you're trying to correct me in my pronunciation, no, I call it that on purpose because I am making fun of that. As it is a common occurrence for series that go over for a significant period of time, such as Star Trek, Star Wars, Pokemon, Final Fantasy, any series that is extended for a lengthy period of time. Harry Potter is actually an excellent example of this, by the way. It is a natural progression for the stories to get more well developed and to be more mature, more adult, to appeal to their audience, which is still following the series by keeping true to the same tones of the original, but at the same time modifying them so that they are more aimed at a more adult audience, right? Now, that's a very common thing in fiction in general. Obviously everything I just named was video games and one book series, but and actually I guess a TV series too. But anyways, the point is this is true across fiction in general, and something that is very common. Now, the reason I say that is, let's just put down some terms here. That is tends to make things more dark, more serious, more adult, and more mature. Darkier and edgier is how people do that incorrectly. And that's why I say it in that term, because I am making fun of that. Now, there is a matter of opinion here involved, obviously, but it is my opinion that when you're doing darkier and edgier, rather than making things more mature, you make them more juvenile. Rather than making things more adult, you make them more showy, flashy, not actually trying to have any substance or meaning or point or anything. And you get my general point here. Now, again, this is a matter of opinion as to what is darkier and edgier as opposed to actually a maturing storyline. But I wanted to get this out here right now because a lot of the changes I would make to this series and to Star Trek in general, admittedly, but especially with Voyager, would probably lean more towards that more adult perspective and the more serious perspective. I've already mentioned this in passing, the ways I would make things a lot more about character development. I would make some of the situations a lot more serious, a lot more well developed. One of the things I feel I have to defend myself on is that if you know anything about my storytelling style, I do tend to lean towards the more what I like to call mature storyline. It has to do with rather dark themes from time to time. I try not to tip over the line, as indeed I don't like that in fiction myself. But my point is, I felt like getting that point out now. How I do admittedly would turn Voyager towards that direction, and there are some people who disagree with me on that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, after all, as long as it is indeed an opinion, but we're not even going to get into that. So I just felt like getting that out right off the bat here. One of the things I really dislike about Voyager was padding. I'll talk about this more in a minute, but right at the beginning of this episode there's a scene where Tom and Kim have a dialogue together that feels extremely forced, extremely rushed, and kind of out of character, really, when you get down to it. That's, of course, debatable because this is the third episode of the series, but even at this point, I remember looking at Tom and thinking, eh? And looking at Kim and thinking, there's nothing there, because there is no character for Kim yet. But despite that fact, this whole scene is so clearly designed for padding, and it's worse because we'll actually get to see this scene twice within this episode, once after the reset and once during the reset. I Sorry, I just was thinking about something that's related to this. I'll get to that later. The real problem I have with this kind of padding, other than the fact that it is padding, in general, padding that is padding, if you know what I mean, is something that really just shouldn't even be there. I know you're trying to fill out a runtime, but do something with it. Add something to it. How about have an actual scene where Tom is first approaching Kim with the idea? Okay, I know that we're getting into changes here, so forgive me, but just spitballing, literally right off the top of my head. What if Tom instead went to Kim and was like, "So, I've got these two women. They're down there, Delaney sisters, blah blah blah," and Kim says, "I've got a girl back home," and Tom says, "Well, that's interesting, but you realize you might never actually get back to her. She might let you go." Instead of portraying someone who is vacuous in his personality, why not have Tom genuinely approach Kim with the serious implications of the fact that the woman he loves may never see him again? Now, that's a serious topic. That's something that should actually be relevant and pertinent and actually have impact rather than just, oh, let's just make a joke about it. And why not have Kim then develop his character, for the first time since the series started, basically, ignoring a few good scenes in Caretaker, I'll give it that, and have Kim start talking about the fact that, for example, let's develop Kim into a romantic. I myself am a romantic. I've said this before, and so I like the idea of, or rather, I'm sorry, not that I like, but a person who is romantic like that will adhere to some extent or another, despite doubts, despite worries, despite fears, that there is such a thing as true love, and therefore Kim, who believes Libby is his true love, does he even mention her name in this episode? I don't think he does. Anyways, that believes that she is his true love, believes that waiting for her is the optimal choice, is something that he doesn't even have a choice on. If you follow what I'm saying here, that is his love. He will wait for her, and he knows she'll wait for him. And of course, even this early on, you could start to show the cracks in that facade, because Kim, at least as we are supposed to be perceiving him, is very intelligent, very math smart, as I like to call it. And it would not be very difficult for Kim to look at that and say, statistically speaking, logically speaking, it's never happening. But still clinging to the hope. We could have had a scene that actually fleshes out both characters and actually gives some characterization to a character who gets almost none, but instead we get this padding scene. You see what I mean about padding for padding's sake. If you're going to pad, if you need to pull out a runtime, do something with it. Sorry, moving on. Um, One of the biggest problems I have with Kess, one of the only problems I have with Kess, actually, is the fact that it's very clear from the way she is presented in the episodes that there was no actual arc designed for her. She never had a character arc mapped out from day one, and she should have. A character like that really should have, in my opinion. What ended up happening is she ended up being kind of a jack of all trades. I've already talked about this. Jack of all trades across everything without actually focusing on anything, and she just kind of ended up being a, if you'll forgive me for another Doctor Who reference, she ended up being kind of a sonic screwdriver. Whatever I needed for this situation, it's there. And if you're doing that with a tool in a show, sure. I may not agree, but sure. If you're doing that with a character, no. Kess really deserved more development in this series, I think. And again, not to go into changes too much, but one of the things I really would have done is I would have had her going towards the mental development powers thing, because that's always been an arc in Star Trek in general, the concept of, moving beyond the flesh and that kind of thing, and the next stage of evolution. That's been a recurring theme since the original series. Having a character on our show, on our crew, who is a regular member of the crew rather than a guest star who happens to, because this has happened to guest stars before, slowly go through that process would be something that at the very least would have an arc to her and define her character in many ways and would help explain many things, but no. Anyways, I will, I have to add something here because this is ridiculous, okay? I was actually giving mild praise to Neelix in both the first episode and this one. Obviously there were some flaws, but at the very least I was on board with the character a little bit. This episode, especially in retrospect, is the moment at which Neelix became the character I just wanted to slug, and the reason most people, even who like Voyager, myself included, look at Neelix and just know, for the most part. He literally goes from useful to useless in the space of one episode, just like that. Boom. And every single one of his scenes is poorly written and poorly developed, and I've got the impression, this could just be me projecting, that Ethan Phillips really resented that fact and really did not enjoy having to portray if I might diverge for just a second, I think Star Trek V is the worst of the Star Trek movies by far. Yes, even worse than Nemesis. And one of the reasons for that, there's actually dozens upon dozens of reasons, which I will not go into here, but one of the reasons is that it was a bad attempt at comedy. Now, we've discussed this before, the fact that comedy is very subjective. I mentioned this in my 10.2 review, that comedy is a subjective thing and very difficult to write. Everybody knows that. Everybody involved in the business in any form, shape, or manner of fictional material knows comedy is hard to write. One of the cheapest ways to do comedy is incompetence. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into that. But the incompetence trend in trending towards comedy is something I've always disliked, especially when you take it to an extreme. When you portray a character that is so incompetent, or incompetent in particular ways that makes it ludicrous, that it goes it's not even non sequitur. It's just, why are you even here? You know. And this is the direction they go with Neelix. Starting this episode, I'm at. Neelix starts to try and be the comic relief character by being an imbecile and portraying a total lack of knowledge and understanding about just about anything. Now, there are some exceptions, and I'll mention them as we go through the series, but in all honesty, what were they thinking? And that brings me to one of the biggest problems with Voyager, and I'm going to talk about this in regard to the next two things here, because I've got two more points, and this is all related to the same problem. Voyager leaned very hard on I hate to call it cliches, because a cliche is not necessarily a bad thing. It really isn't. Essentially, tropes, really, is what it comes down to. Now, utilizing a standard existing literary trope is not a bad thing. Let's just make that absolutely clear. But when you look at the textbook, if you'll follow with me metaphorically here, if you look at a textbook and, okay, let's see, we need to have a character who is humorous. Well, one of the ways to inject humor is to have a character who is bumbling or otherwise has difficulties. Okay, boom. And then they stop reading at that point and they're like, done, Neelix, boom, he's incompetent and bumbling and an idiot. Done. And, okay, let's see what else we got here. Okay, we need to flesh out some of our scenes, but we don't actually know enough about science to do so. So it is acceptable in a science fiction method to make up science, and then they stop reading and they're like, boom, done. Okay, we're going to have technobabble coming out of our ears in every single scene. Okay, next thing. And the third point is later on in the episode, there's a scene where the dissident leader has his dissident second in command, which is so cliche it's not even ridiculous. It's a kind of literary trope that's a little less obvious than the previous two I just mentioned. But basically, if you want a leader an individual who is a leader, who is in a position of power to appear more reasonable, what you do is you present one of his subordinates who does all the horrible things or is suspicious or whatever, so that by contrast, he can appear much more reasonable while the actual dirty stuff is happening with his consent by the second person. This is something people do in real life too, I might add. But in fiction, it's just cheap. Now to really make this a point here, you can start with the basic textbook examples of these tropes, of these cliches, if you will, and then work with them. That's the important part. You work with them, you develop them, you do something with them rather than just copy pasting from the textbook onto your show. And this is a problem Voyager has through a very large amount of its run, is they use copy-paste textbook examples of cliches and tropes and things like that really just feels lazy and cheap, and it sells the audience short, because let's be honest, for a long time, Trek fans, whether Trekkies or Trekkers, have been viewed at a negative. It's a similar social bias that we've had against video gamers, for example, and tabletop gamers and things like that. These are the things we're still fighting against today. But the reality of the situation is that when you are trying to sell something to that audience, you should not also buy into that bias. You should accept that your audience, or at the very least portray, even if you don't believe it, that your audience is someone who is at least moderately intelligent and accepting, and especially this far into a franchise, mature and adult. And you should look at them as that and treat them as that, because all you're doing otherwise is insulting them. And that's what Voyager does. Now, let's go ahead and move on to my next point here. I do have to say a great deal of praise for Jennifer Lean, which I'm still not sure how to pronounce her last name. She showed a massive amount of trauma for the event that happened. Now, if this had been developed more, this would have been a beautiful way to show a counterpoint to the episode. We have the crew of Voyager who have scanners and sensors and a dead planet with nothing organic alive on it, and they have these tricorders that they're going through. My point is, this portrayal of this disaster, this tragedy, is very distant. If I might pull it to a real life example, it's like you're finding out about something. I'm not going to use an actual tragedy. Let's just say something horrible happened, and you find out about it on the news, either on the television or on the internet, or if you happen to live 50 years ago, you find it on the newspaper. Something like that, right? You read the details of this, but ultimately it is still statistics. It's still distant from you, right? With Kess, who is someone who was psychically linked with the event and with the moment of the tragedy, we have then a personal way of showing it. We could have seen so much of this episode through Kess's eyes. Her B plot could have been elevated to greater importance in place of the A plot and in place of the padding, in order to show us a personal side of this terrible tragedy. Because, well, I've talked about this sort of thing before, but if you'll forgive me for misquoting Joseph Stalin, uh, if you kill 1 man, it is a tragedy. If you kill 1 million, it is a statistic. Human beings have trouble picturing 1 million people. So why not actually show us 1 million people? If you see where I'm going with this, why not actually have Kess see these people, these children, these grandparents, and couples, and people who are, boss and coworker, and just all aspects of life, who are interacting with each other, and then the moment of their annihilation and incineration. That is a horribly personal way to perceive such a terrible tragedy. It would be like in the totally fictional tragedy I just made up, which I didn't even detail, if you were right there when it happened. That's different from reading about it, or seeing about it, or hearing a news report about it. You understand what I'm saying? And so showing us those two sides of it would have been an excellent way to flesh out the story, and in place of the ridiculous padding. But anyways, I'm sorry I keep mentioning the padding, but let's get on to my next point, which is there's too much padding in this episode. No, seriously. I actually have a note here. I don't know if you can read my terrible, terrible handwriting, but it literally just says technobabble. Now, I've railed against technobabble before, and I've given my reasons for railing against technobabble before, but this is one of the worst examples of technobabble, because it is the two negative qualities I dislike most. Not even try to phrase that sentence right. About technobabble in one beautiful little package. It is the two worst. Whatever, I said it right. Number one, it's padding. We've already talked about this, and number two, it's insulting the audience, which again we already talked about. Made-up science is something you have to live with in a science fiction show. Okay, I'm with that. It's not that hard to come up with something that is actually at least moderately scientific, rather than babbling nonsense that literally means nothing at each other. I mean, for goodness sakes, people. And so there are I actually stopped counting, because when I was rewatching this episode, I started skipping through each scene that was just a technobabble scene, because literally you could replace that scene with a giant picture. I could scroll technobabble across the paper and hold it up like this, and this is the scene right here. There is nothing added or taken away. There is no elaboration on anything that actually matters. There's no character development. There's no adding to the story. There's no adding to the plot. There's nothing at all until the last two instances of it, in which case they're finally actually doing something with it. Every single one of them is just pointless and might as well not even be there. And that is my biggest problem with technobabble as its application in Star Trek Voyager. This is treading on some territory that a lot of Trek fans tend to disagree on, but one of the biggest problems of Voyager, and I've talked about this before, is that it was TNG, but exaggerated, basically. Now, TNG managed to hit a nice sweet spot, in my opinion, of having good characterization while at the same time being a complete fantasy, if you understand what I mean here. Voyager went too far with that, and we get obviously technobabble basically started in the TNG era, but we get so much more of it in Voyager. Obviously, the cliched use of Trek tropes started in TNG, really. But that gets so much worse in Voyager. You get where I'm going with this. Everything that was negative about, well, not even the negatives, everything about TNG that was there was exaggerated, and in so exaggerating, they lost any positive qualities it might have had, if you understand what I mean. I'm sorry, I'm just distinctly recalled of an episode in TNG, yeah, I can't remember what, it's one of the Q ones. I can't remember which episode name it was, but it's the one where Q loses his powers and is returned as a human briefly, and the Calamarain or the Callictressus or whatever they call themselves are attacking, and the they need to figure out if they can stop this asteroid from hitting the Earth, or I'm sorry, not the Earth, a planet. And if Geordi basically says they need a certain amount of delta V in order to get it to stop, and they don't think they can do that, and they try it and it doesn't work. That's not technobabble, is kind of my point. That is actual science and math that they were talking about here. That's real, we know it now, science. And I mention that because it's still applicable even in a science fiction show. We don't have tractor beams here in real life. I mean, obviously we have things that... let's not get into that. We don't have Star Trek tractor beams here in real life. But the physics that we know here in real life still applies. Now, this may sound like me being banal, and I do apologize. I don't want the show to be absolutely scientifically correct at all times. That's also ridiculous. What I want it to be is not the opposite extreme. There is a middle ground here between everything has to be exactly scientifically correct down to, every calculation made so that the story makes sense in a real life sense, is realistic, not just believable. And the other ludicrous extreme, which I could just summarize by saying Star Trek Voyager. I'm sorry, I'm kind of ranting here, but this is a really bad episode for that. There were something like 5 scenes. I stopped counting. I stopped counting after 5 of just mindless technobabble that meant nothing and added nothing. And I also feel like this is a good moment to point out that even though I do defend the show to an extent, that doesn't mean I'm not saying it's a great show. I'm not saying it's the best Star Trek ever, and I'm not saying that it doesn't have flaws, obviously, because I just ranted for like 10 minutes about it. But I do still believe that some positives can be found even in a show like this one, and I'll talk about that more later. But let's just move on here. I also have a note here which I call Neelix equals idiot. This is separate from my earlier note, by the way. Anybody out there who's been in a relationship that is even remotely serious knows that when your loved one is going through something horrifying and traumatic, whether it is real or not, imagined or, as a result of a mental illness, or a really bad dream they had that was very stark and vivid, or something that actually happened, one of the things you want to do, bear with me here because I know this is crazy, is actually be there for that person. Try to be supportive, try to be comforting, try to be helpful. Neelix, in the scene where Jennifer Lean is pouring her heart out, and doing an excellent job, by the way, very good props to the actress, is treating her like... I don't even have a good analogy for this. He is treating her like she's stupid, or like she's making it up, or that she doesn't know what she's talking about. I'm sorry, but no, that's not how that works, and that really was just mind-bogglingly stupid, even at the time. Anyways, let's move on. Okay, I apologize for bashing this point in for, I believe, the 3rd time since I've started this series. This is the 3rd episode, in case you weren't keeping track. The Doctor scene really is pure gold. There's like one nitpick I would have with the scene if it came down to it, and that is the fact that he has a line which, again, sells the audience short. It isn't as subtle as it should be. It wasn't subtle to begin with, but then he goes over and says, "This is the joke," and I hate it when Voyager does that. But he actually has a genuinely humorous line where he says, "You are the healthiest member of your species I've ever seen." And if it stopped there, that would have been great. I actually grinned at that, even when I was rewatching it this time around. But then he immediately turns around and says, "You're the only member of you're the only one I've ever seen. You're the only member of the species I've ever seen. Here's the joke." Other than that, though, I do like his comments to Kess about the fact that space travel is different than anything she's experienced before, about how the body has to adapt and change, and surely the mind does as well, and blah, blah, blah. I actually liked that. I thought that was a nice touch of believability to the show, and helped to remind us of the fact that Kess, until quite recently, was not a space traveler, and to remind us of the fact that there is a difference between living in a science fiction setting and living on a ship in a science fiction setting. And I like that. I actually did genuinely like that. So props to the Doctor and to Jennifer for that one. Here's that point I mentioned about the cliche with the guy. In brief, there's a gentleman who is the head of the dissidents, and he is, he's trying to be understanding, and, blah, 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 and his lackey is so obviously over-the-top cliched, I'm suspicious about everything. what I find amusing about that, even in fictional circles, someone who is suspicious of someone else in a well-written piece generally doesn't look at them and be like, are you secretly Hitler? I think you might be. Maybe I should ask you if you're secretly Hitler so you can tell. No, that's not how it works like that. But that's what this guy was doing. He was so obvious and so overt and so over the top that it destroyed any subtlety that may have ever been intended with the performance. It was ridiculous. Um, Now, I underlined this comment 3 times because this is something I've been dancing around whether or not I should comment on. I know Trek fans in general are very divisive about everything. There are people who will defend Nemesis, Threshold, and Star Trek V, in my opinion, 3 of the worst examples of Star Trek ever made. And yet, I feel I have to comment because there is one thing I must make a note of, and this is something that's been commented on by others. Apologies to Sci-Fi Debris. I'm not trying to retread your territory here. Not that you watch my show. But there is a scene where they'd start discussing the Prime Directive for the first time in Voyager. Now, the Prime Directive has been an aspect of Star Trek since the original series. It has been interpreted differently in each series as it goes along. And it is an extremely gray and morphic and dynamic type of ruling, in my opinion, or I guess I should say it should be. It should be depending on the circumstances. It should not be a hard and fast rule because when you're, or law, I'm sorry, it should not be a hard and fast law because when you're dealing with something that important, that impacting, that long-term potential, then if you just say A is A and B is B, then you're wrong. I'm sorry. That is my opinion, I'll admit, but it is my opinion that you are wrong if you lay down such a flat, hard law for something that is so complicated, really. Now, every time it is perceived throughout the various series, there's some discussion about it. What I love about Voyager is that one of the biggest discussions about the Prime Directive in Voyager, there's like 3 I can think of total, and this is one of them right here. This discussion goes from Janeway saying to Tom, "You have no idea what the consequences of warning these people are. By the way, this is an entire planet that has been wiped out of all life. Billions of lives just got extinguished within a few seconds." I just feel like getting that point across, okay? So she says, "You have no idea what the consequences are of warning these people." Okay, that's a valid starting point. It is. I'll admit it. His response is that the consequences would have to be greater than mass annihilation or mass destruction or however he puts it. Okay, that is also a valid point. We now have 2 perspectives. Let's have a real discussion about it. The problem is what Voyager then does is has Janeway, with the very next line, say, "You're not to warn these people, that's an order." The escalation of that argument, the way that is presented, is ridiculous, in my opinion. That is pure. That is not only illogical. That is unemotional. There is nothing to guide that. That is simply getting back to what I was just talking about. That makes it a law. You are not to warn these people because that's an order, and that's the end of the discussion. No, that's not how that works. Even ignoring the fact that I personally very vehemently disagree with the Prime Directive. Let's just ignore that. I'm trying to leave that opinion on the sideline to discuss this like a rational human being. You have to meet me halfway here, episode. You have to also come here and say, yes, okay, we'll look at this in a 2-way light rather than just this is the law. That is it. Now I actually get genuinely upset about the Prime Directive, especially its application in Voyager, and most especially in Enterprise, but we're not going to get into that. I just feel it is worth noting that the Prime Directive issue would have been a lot more well fleshed out and more developed if everything I had said earlier about Kess had been true. It is a lot easier to condemn a number to total extinction than it is to condemn a face, or faces, or names, or personalities. If we had seen the personal side of things through Kess's viewpoint, while at the same time keeping in mind the statistics of the crew's viewpoint, it would have brought a great more, and I hate to keep using this term, it would have brought a human factor to things, a personal factor, and I think the show suffered for lacking in doing that. Now then. Now there's one thing I meant to comment on earlier, and I kind of skipped over it because I wanted to talk about the cliches thing. There are several instances in this episode where they go down to the planet in the present after the explosion, And this has been commented on by several other individuals too, but one of the things I feel most strongly about is the planet is all they took the sets and they gave them this blue overcast lighting and everything's dark and terrible, right? Because it's a dead planet, it has to look all terrible and dark. This also buys into that cliches thing I was talking about earlier, admittedly. Why not take that and twist it on its head, especially for two reasons, which I'll get into here. Imagine if this planet is obviously there's some sign of damage, and I'm not going to talk about the inconsistencies between an explosion that actually damaged the ship and yet left most of the buildings and pillars intact. We're not just going to comment on that. Let's just take everything at face value. This explosion has wiped out all organic life and left the buildings intact. Okay, would it not have added a terribly creepy, almost terrifying atmosphere to the perspective if everything had been sunny and cheery, basically? There was a couple of clouds in the sky. There's no birds, obviously. There's no flora in order to keep everything light. But it's just nice and bright and sunny and everything's fine, except for the fact that there's no people there, or animals, or anything. Would that have not added a beautiful layer of atmosphere to that scene? Second point. Later on, Kess goes down there and is walking around and is like, I can almost, she's talking about how she can almost touch the people. She can almost sense them right there. Again, I would have liked to see some of her perspective, but let's just ignore that for a moment. Even taking the episode on its face, would that have not been much more powerful if, again, it was nice and bright and sunny and cheery? This woman talking about all these horribly dead people who is basically feeling echoes of what used to be here in an otherwise normal, perfectly normal town center, basically. If you follow where I'm going with this? Would that have not added? Granted, this is a minor touch, but as I've said before, I am going to comment on minor touches. I like minor touches. I like subtleties. I like little things. What do you want from me? Blah 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 blah. Guess thing. I try not to comment on plot holes. I really don't, because again, I'm trying to be more positive than negative, and I think I'm failing on this episode. It's probably obvious I don't care for this one that much. But the sheer ease with which the team infiltrates the plant, literally within a day of the period of which they were leading a demonstration which ended in violence against them, it just kind of that always kind of made me go, huh? And again, I just want to feel I'd feel like I point out, perhaps a little bit defensively, this is not me complaining that a torpedo tube came out of the warp nacelle or something like that. No, 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 no. This is just basic logic. This is basic comic sense. This is trying to, as I've said before, Star Trek is a tale, not a believable story. But would it have not been more believable for them to actually have to infiltrate this place rather than, walk up to the front door and say, "Hey, let us in. We've got a hostage"? No. I'm sorry. Again, little things, little things. Let's just move on. Much as I would change about this episode, which I'm going to get into just shortly because I'm almost at the end of this, I do actually like how they did develop Tom as a character within this episode. Not counting the padding scenes I mentioned earlier, where he was basically out of character, in my opinion. I do like that his opinion on the Prime Directive and his portrayal of it was actually presented. I do like the fact that Tom gave his arguments and that they were portrayed as... Well, they were portrayed, I guess I should say. Janeway's perspective on the Prime Directive wasn't actually portrayed. She began her argument and then cut off the argument. Tom, on several occasions, gives his side of things very clearly, and his interactions with the boy most especially emphasize his perspective. Again, that personal nature. He is seeing an individual life that is about to be snuffed out. His scene where he actually turns to the kid and says he's sorry, I liked that. And again, it showed that side of things, the other side, the right side, or not right as in correct, but right as in this is my right hand. the side with the pen on it, to try and distance myself from trying to pretend this is correct or incorrect. Of that perspective, of that argument, of that discussion. And I liked his development as showing one of the things I've always liked best about Tom Paris. One of the reasons he's one of my favorite characters is that he's a very moral individual. He has a great sense of right and wrong. And I like that about him. And I like the fact that he presents that within this episode. It's one of the few things I really do like about it. It was a little rushed, I'll be honest. Because, by God, we gotta get those technobabble padding scenes in. I'm done. Now, did I like it then, and did I like it now? The note I made here is actually kind of funny. Both then and now, the same thought occurred to me pretty much first off. You're having a time travel episode in the third episode of a Star Trek series. Really, you're reverting to that so quickly? Now I know Star Trek and time travel has always kind of had a strange relationship with each other, often with a lot of alcohol involved. But I really wish they hadn't leapt to that cliche so quickly. The only show to do that worse is Enterprise, which did that with the opening episode, and we all know how well that turned out. Anyways, did I like it then? Not really. At the time, I thought it was an interesting way of approaching paradoxes, even though it was done, in a way that doesn't actually make sense. But I do admit I like that kind of looping in itself type of storyline, and I do like I like doing that type of storyline myself. The only difference is I try to plan it out well in advance, so I know exactly how it's going to loop into itself without having to spontaneously say, nah, and then everything's fixed. And rewatching it, I obviously like it a lot less. And the biggest reason, and I hate to keep banging on about this, is the prime directive problem and the technobabble problem. Between these 2 points, both of which irritate me personally and as a viewer, it felt like the episode was just doing this the whole time. And while some out there, probably not who watch this show, but some people in general would say, yeah, you're a loser because you're watching Star Trek. All I have to say to that is, what's the difference between me watching Star Trek and me watching sports? Or me watching some racing? Or perhaps me watching a reality TV show? Just because this is my preferred medium of entertainment and intellectual engagement, indeed when it is engaged, does not make me any more or less of a loser than you are. So, not sure what the point is there. Moving on. Changes. I talked about the Sunny thing, but that's a really small problem. I want to discuss something here because this is something I kind of had to do a hard rule for myself for this section. A lot of people, I know in person, wanted me to do this changes section for these reviews, and so I've continued doing these. But I had to limit myself. Because if I really was going to change Voyager, I would change the whole series. I would restructure so much of the show that at a certain point I couldn't say what I'd change about an episode because this episode would have never happened. We would be in a completely other story arc at this point. So within the confines of the episode, what would I change? But even that has some problems and some complexities because, for example, let me use an example of a later episode, which is where this really came up. There's an episode called Threshold. I've alluded to it before. I have made a solemn promise that I am actually going to review Threshold when I get there, even though I don't actually want to all that much. But several people have asked me to, and I don't want to cheat. I don't want to throw in the towel, basically, on this one. But Threshold is an episode that is so ludicrously bad at its premise, at its base core, that how do I change that episode in any way? At some point, I'm changing the episode to the point where it's completely unrecognizable from the original. Where do I define the line, in other words? What defines the base elements of an episode that I have to adhere to in order to then affix my changes onto it? Now that's a debate I'm actually still continuing on, but with this one I found myself very much unsure of what I would consider to be the base elements of the episode because there's so much about it I would change if I did. But finally I decided, okay, planet using polaric energy, which is a ticking time bomb, something that can wipe out organic life. Not create an actual explosion, this is important, but something that will annihilate organic life. Break it down at a, let's say at a molecular level, because that makes more sense than, say, at an atomic level. And the Kess developing her powers. Those two tenets are what I decided were the base premises of this episode, not time travel. And I mentioned that because I came up with two alternate ideas for this one. I hope you don't mind if I enjoy both. Or if I enjoy both. I enjoy my own ideas. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. I hope you don't mind if I go into both here. Point one. Why not make it so that the crew never actually gets caught in these subspace technobabble bubbles and gets trapped in the past? Just eject the past scenes. Literally, 100%, poof, gone. All of them. You with me now? Now, there is a way we would still see the past, and you've probably already surmised what that is based on what I've been talking about. Kess, okay, I talked about in the previous episode, Parallax, that I would like to see more character development, especially this early in the series. And I like the format in a television format, of doing three characters getting a decent amount of character development, whether they are A, B, or C list cast members, doesn't matter. Three characters getting a good amount of character development, and having at least five in the background here, like this, getting some background development. Okay, that's just my preference. That's my opinion as a director, as a writer. But why not have this episode focus on Kess, Kim, and Tom Paris? Now, let's say that they don't detect they detect a massive explosion, but it doesn't actually hit the ship because that doesn't make sense. And let's say they go to investigate because duh, really. I mean, I don't even have to make up a reason for that. They go to investigate a massive explosion because duh. They find out that its source is a planet which is reading zero life signs. They do a few studies of the system and conclude that what happened was a polaric reaction occurred. This is the point at which Tuvok brings up the fact that, polaric energy was something that was used as a weapon, blah, blah, blah. Keep in mind they're still on the ship at this point. Because, well, A, I don't know about you, but to me it would seem really silly to beam down into a situation like that. But B, and more importantly, because it doesn't have to be on the planet. We don't have to show the planet. Not like this. Remember everything I talked about earlier about the difference between the distance perspective of reading a news report and the personal perspective? Why not actually emphasize that? Never have them go down to the planet. Have them on the ship. Have them reading sensor readings. Have them reciting out statistics. Let's hear how many people died. 6.2 billion, just off the top of my head. Boom. 6.2 billion estimated losses based on the infrastructure of the way the cities were outlined. Stuff like that. Give us numbers to give us an idea so that our brain can wrap ourselves, at least mildly, around the idea of the tragedy, then have Kess show up. Then have Kess give the personal aspect of things. Why not actually show things from Kess's perspective? Why not have Kess, do this thing, and then she starts having visions of her head of these people at the moment of destruction. And again, like I said, kids and people, you would still be down there on the planet, sunny, bright, lots of flowers, maybe have a bird flying around, something like that. I know that's cliche, but whatever. And maybe not the bird. But seriously, have just normal people. And I want to stress, don't go too far. Don't have it be like kids wearing pink, jumping around going, we love life. No, 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 no. Just have people, ordinary people, going about their lives with absolutely no warning whatsoever that anything's going to happen. And then whoosh. And they have a few seconds. And make it only last like 2 seconds total. Even in slow motion, have it last maybe like 4 seconds grand total of them getting obliterated, burnt, nothing left but ash, and then show us a few seconds of the aftermath as Kess is viewing this planet, which is still bright and sunny and cheery, and dead, and see the ash piles on the ground, and have Kess scream, and oh my god, and everyone's like, oh my god, what's wrong, Kess? Have us give the viewer that personal viewpoint of exactly how horrifying this tragedy is. Now, where am I going with all this? The basic premise here, in my opinion, is to let's go ahead and throw a little bit of technobabble in, just a little bit, and say that there are some subspace bubbles in here that are interacting with time in an odd manner. Let's say they want to examine in the past, and I'm just going to skip ahead here a bit because I want to summarize a bit because this review is already going on a little bit longer than I wanted to. Let's say that the summary here is that their investigations into the past are what causes this accident to happen, okay? They interact in a way that they shouldn't have with the alien nature of the past reality and the subspace warping whatever signals they're sending through, and whoosh. Now let's say it is Kess who ends up discovering that is the problem and trying to inform them in some manner that she actually, for example, hears Janeway's voice at a certain point, or feels the interactions, or like something. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't think I need to, but the general point here is that they successfully stop themselves from doing so, end up ceasing the destruction of the planet, and then boom, we get the reset, right? Now, I consider this my least favorite of the two ideas I came up with because it still employs a lot of Trek cliches, and it still has kind of a silly plot. But again, when I'm limited to the premise, I have so little freedom. I ended up still, after I came up with that idea, I ended up still thinking about it for quite a while, just sitting there, just racking my brain. And the other idea I came up with, I like a hell of a lot more. Why not have it that the planet hasn't actually exploded yet? Why not have it such that rather than we find out about this incident and there being time travel involved, They're going through this sector. Neelix informs them there's a peaceful planet in the area. It's moderately advanced. They have some space, minor space flight, like modern age real life, for example. They have satellite networks and they have some ability to go into space and space stations, that kind of thing. Just barely dipping their toe into the water, so to speak. However, he does know that they have a great deal of, they have an excellent energy supply of whatever it is. He doesn't know that, he doesn't actually know it. Now, when they get there and they start scanning the planet, they find out that it's polaric energy, which, and this is one of the things I would keep from the basic premise, that polaric energy equals bad. And again, we can have that line about the weapon thing from the Romulans. That's fine. The point is, the dilemma at this point becomes, do we do anything about this? In my opinion, this would be a far more mature and adult take on the standard Star Trek dilemma. Should we involve ourselves? You can discuss the Prime Directive all you want in this episode too, and I'm not going to mention how much it would be discussed. It should be brought up. But one of the things I feel that really should also happen in this episode is that there should be people who are both for and against, that they should have a real discussion about it. And one of the things that should be brought up in the don't warn these people in the pro Prime Directive category is two things actually that should be brought up in that camp. One, if we give these people the answers, they may never actually appreciate having the answers themselves. The whole concept of work for it yourself, which has some very valid applications. And two, half this planet is built upon this powder keg. Simply converting that over is not going to happen overnight. Imagine for a moment if some aliens came by Earth right now, Voyager came by and everyone's like and sorry, and aliens come by to Earth and started talking with the leaders of Earth, and again, I'd use this example because I think it's a perfect analogy, because there's no leader of Earth. There's barely leaders of there's not even leaders of continents. There's barely leaders of nations. And so who do they discuss things with, first of all? And second of all, how much power do those people have to, let's use the analogy. Let's say that coal or oil or something equivalent, natural gas, is a powder keg, and if something goes wrong, the whole planet will go up in smoke. Obviously, this is a fiction, but just bear with me for the analogy here, okay? Even if we knew that information, would we stop it? Would people change over? Would we find a new energy source? Even if these aliens helped us find a new energy source, how long of a process would that be? Especially if they decided not to stay around and help. There are complexities to an issue like that. That is a real dilemma. Because even ignoring the possibilities of you don't know the consequences, even if we were to ignore that, this is not a simple issue. This is the overhauling of infrastructure of an entire planet in a way that is infeasible without great difficulty, time, effort, planning, and effort, or no, not effort, motivation. Who knows if these leaders would even listen to us, right? And then we take the other side of the perspective, which is, of course, the obvious one. These people could blow themselves all up with any moment. All it would take is one thing to go wrong, and poof. Never mind the fact that what if these and one of the arguments that the people in favor of helping could put out is, what if these people keep using this energy source when they finally reach out to the stars? What if they're still using polaric energy when they start to reach out and head to other planets and head to other colonies? Wouldn't the consequences be even more far-fetched, or not far-fetched, widespread, and have more difficulty at that point? But of course the con people could say at that point, it is also very feasible that they could have an accident somewhere early on where, say, one of the ships that is using polaric energy goes poof and all the organic life on there dies. And that could be a pivotal point for the culture and for the economy and the industry to overturn itself and find another energy source. But then the pro people could also say, what if they can't find another energy source? What if they don't know about one? What if they can't find one in time? What if their efforts to find one are stymied by politics and economics? You see where I'm going with this. This sounds a little bit boring, I'm sure, and I do apologize, but this is a very serious, engaging, real dilemma that the crew could actually face and genuinely look at, and we could learn more about Tom Paris, who would of course be on the pro side, Kim, who I think would be on the con side, because Kim is A, fresh from the academy, B, not very experienced, and C, math smart. He can look at the numbers, he can look at the perspective, he can look at the logic and say blah, and say it is logical for us to not. I mean, it makes sense. There are so many variables involved. Tom, who is not fresh from the academy, is very well experienced and well versed, at least in my version of him, and extremely moral individual, would look at all that and say that's irrelevant compared to the fact that we'd be saving billions of lives. And those two perspectives could clash, and it would be wonderful too because we could have had the first real argument in the friendship between Tom and Kim over something real rather than whether or not to date the Delaney sisters. You follow where I'm going with this? Now, where would I go with this in the end? See, that's the actual catch. It is my opinion that Voyager didn't take any risks within its run. This is not an uncommon opinion. I've heard a lot of other people say this, and this is one of the biggest, if not the single biggest flaw of Voyager, is the fact that it never took risks. It never tried to stretch its boundaries beyond the basic, Star Trek formula that it had settled into. So whether or not you actually have the ship stay and deal with this, maybe even over a course of a two-parter, is an interesting question. Or whether or not you have them actually contact them and be rebuffed. Or maybe my point is that there are several ways that this could go. It would be cheap, in my opinion, to simply have the Voyager crew leave. To decide we're not interfering and leave, because at that point, effectively, everything you've just done is for nothing. The way I would do it personally, and I've thought about this considerably, is I would have them eventually decide, after everything's said and done, I'm sorry, I actually missed a point here. I would have had Kes still getting the visions. Like I said, this is still an episode I would be developing Kes in. And she would start learning about her powers, start learning about her past. There would be the scene with the Doctor still. I basically wouldn't even have to change that. That would be awesome. Except for the Captain is missing part. And I would have loved to bring the Doctor in on this discussion too. Because the Doctor, despite being a hologram, is still very ethically bound. Almost to the point of total ethics, if you know what I mean. To him, the solution is obvious. We have to help these people. Kes would be on the side of helping these people because the visions she's getting are from the future. She sees a future in which this place explodes. Now, one of the things I would do is I would make it ambiguous as to whether this is a potential future or something that is guaranteed, something that is destined to happen or whatever. I would make that ambiguous. I would leave it up to the viewer to decide. And of course, the crew would bring up the same point. We don't know if what you're seeing is actually going to happen. We don't know if what you're seeing is part of your imagination. Even when we are more certain about trusting you, Kes, and trusting your opinion, because she gives her argument and gives her passion to please so powerfully and so emotionally, we believe that you have seen a possible future of these people, but we don't know if it's the possible future, because Star Trek has already established the branching timelines thing, which we're not even going to go into. And so in this development, the crew finally decides, based on everything, based on everyone's recommendations, we have to at least try. As human beings, and I shouldn't, as sentient beings, really, because this is Star Trek. As sentient beings, the decision should ultimately be we should try. And they do try, and they fail. They fail miserably. They can't even find someone in sufficient enough authority. Let's say this place is effectively a widespread confederacy of sorts. Not even it's not even actually a confederacy, because the confederacy is still localized I'm sorry, is still. I'm sorry, my words are gone today. A confederacy is still a single organization with dealing with exterior powers. This is just a bunch of city-states, basically. There is no such thing as someone in power. The reason polaric energy is used by everyone is because it's the technology they've had for hundreds of years at this point. Let's actually say it has been quite a while, and they've just gotten really lucky. But as they continue to industrialize, and as standards get more lax, and as the companies and corporations start taking over, there is a very high chance, a very high risk that this is going to go up really badly in the future. And so they try to contact these people, and they basically can't find anyone in actual authority to listen to them. Not even to listen to them part. It's just they can't actually find anybody in real authority. However, one of the things I would also do is I would say they also succeed. Let's say they find a few people. Let's say they find a couple of city-state governors or whatnot. Let's say they find a few movements, a few corporate heads who actually believe the figures. Because they don't just bring, oh, it's the end of the world. They show facts, they show figures, they show numbers, they show math. And several of these people do believe them, because I believe that even here on Earth, in my analogy I mentioned earlier, some people would listen. And basically, I would kind of end the episode on that point, if you understand what I mean. They would give the information across. They would, and I think this would be a big point, and not something that could be decided, just like, oh, let's do this. But I think they would deliberate over the situation as the people are, let's say one of the city state leaders, let's call him Bob. Bob says to Janeway, I believe you. I understand your work. I understand the figures you're giving me. Everything makes perfect sense. What do I do about it? We don't have any other real source of energy. We have very few natural resources on this planet that can be used for any significant fuel to keep our planet going. If my city just kind of shuts down, it'll just be absorbed by one of the other corporations or one of the other city-states, and they'll just use polaric energy anyways. We need an alternative. Do you have an alternative? And Janeway's like, damn. Because all of a sudden, yes, they do have an alternative. The crew of the Voyager has technology and information on technology that can be used to produce energy resources far beyond anything of this polaric energy. But do they share that with these people? At this point, not only are they helping on moral standards, but now they're actually interfering with their history. Now the issue has become even more complicated. I'd make that like the end of the Act 1 or Act 2 section right there. And then the real debate then becomes, do we share any information with these people? And it's the same debate all over again, except now it's worse because now it's gotten more complicated and it's more in-depth. Now we are really interfering with these people's natural development. Period. There's no arguing that point at this point. Is that, at this point, a good thing or not? Now I admit, and this is again branching from opinion, and if I was actually in charge of this show, I would seek out other opinions. I tend to do that anyways. It's a common thing for writers to get buy-in, basically, of a sort from others in order to get differing perspectives. It's a very important thing to see perspectives other than your own when you're writing. But since I have no one to ask at this point, I would probably go ahead and say yes, they do share some information on some basic technologies, some of the more mundane or easy to do technologies. Let me give you an example here. Again, with this real life analogy. We know that fusion power is possible, feasible. We have the math to support it. We just do not have the engineering to construct it. Let us say this ship that came along that said, oil or coal or whatever is a time bomb. What if they gave us the actual engineering capacity to create fusion power and actually make it work? Now that would still be a struggle, but it's something we already knew existed, something we already had theorized about, something we know could do. It's just we have now been handed a skip to the next level thing. The warp pipe popped up and we're like, and now we're in 3-2 instead of 3-1. You follow me? That is the geekiest analogy I've ever used. That's what I would have had them do. Give them some access to some form of technology that is something that was already theoretically possible, something they already knew about, just couldn't do, and actually make it feasible, actually make it functional. But because, and I would end the episode on a combination of sadness and hope. Because on the one hand, they didn't save the planet. They did everything they could. But on the other hand, there is hope that at the very least some people and some members of that planet might learn and might grow, and this might go somewhere, and they might still survive rather than all dying truly horrific, terrifying deaths. That is what I would have done. I apologize for taking so long, but this is the first time where my alternate episode has been very violently different from the standard one, and I really wanted to get that out there. Now, I'm going to hit stop here, and I'm going to upload this, and then you're going